The screaming started at 0347 hours Terran Standard, though on Cadia, time had long ceased to matter. Marshal Marius Amalrich stood on the battlements of the Casa fortress, watching the sky bleed purple and gold as reality itself tore apart above his homeworld. The 13th Black Crusade had come at last, and with it, the fulfillment of prophecies that should have remained buried in the darkest archives of the Imperium. Cadia had stood for 10,000 years as the sentinel of the Cadian Gate, the only stable passage through the Eye of Terror that allowed large-scale movement between the cursed realm of chaos and the worlds of men. For 10 millennia, the planet had been a fortress entire, its very stones blessed by the Emperor and consecrated with the blood of countless heroes. Every child born on Cadia learned to hold a lasgun before they could properly walk. Every prayer spoken in its cathedrals was also a battle hymn. Every sunset painted the sky with the reflected light of distant war. But on this day, as the despoiler's fleet darkened the heavens like a plague of iron locusts, even the most faithful among the Cadian defenders began to understand that their world was dying. The fortress shook as another bombardment struck the outer walls. Dust cascaded from the ancient stonework, and somewhere in the depths of the structure, Amalrich could hear the distinctive crack of ceramite giving way under stress. The sound was familiar after months of siege, but it never became comfortable. Each crack represented another small failure of the defenses, another step toward the inevitable collapse that waited at the end of every battle. "Sir," Corporal Vex called from the communications station, his voice cutting through the constant rumble of distant explosions. "We're receiving multiple priority transmissions from across the continent. Fortress Elysian reports massive daemon incursions in sectors 7 through 12. Casa Partox is requesting immediate reinforcement. And there's something else, sir. Something from orbit." Amalrich turned from his contemplation of the burning sky, his bionic eye clicking as it adjusted to the dimmer light of the command chamber. The eye had been a gift from the Mechanicus, after a shard of chaos-tainted metal had taken his original sight during the siege of Mordax Prime. The replacement was supposed to be an improvement, capable of perceiving electromagnetic spectra invisible to baseline human vision. But right now, it was showing him things he wished he could unsee. Through the enhanced optics, the orbital space around Cadia looked like a wound in the universe. The Chaos Fleet hung there like a collection of diseased organs, their hulls twisted into shapes that hurt to perceive directly. Some of the vessels appeared to be constructed from materials that should not exist, their surfaces flowing like liquid while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for void travel. Others seemed to phase in and out of visible space, their presence confirmed only by the gravitational distortions they left in their wake. But it was the thing at the center of the fleet that commanded his attention. The Blackstone Fortress hung motionless above Cadia's northern hemisphere, its ancient mechanisms focused on a single, terrible purpose. The fortress was a relic of the war in heaven, built by the Necrons in ages past when the galaxy was young and the current species were little more than ambitious bacteria. The Imperium had captured it centuries ago, but the despoiler had taken it from them through treachery and blood. Now it served his purposes, its reality-warping weapons aimed at the very heart of Cadia's defenses. "What kind of transmission from orbit?" Amalrich asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Vex's face had gone pale beneath his helmet's rim. The young corporal had served with distinction through the entire siege, had proven himself capable of maintaining composure under the most extreme stress. But whatever he had heard in that transmission had shaken him to his core. "It's from the Blackstone Fortress, sir. The message is, it's addressed to you personally." The silence that followed that statement stretched for several seconds, broken only by the constant background noise of war. Personal communications from Chaos commanders were not unknown during siege operations, but they were rarely anything other than attempts at psychological warfare. Demands for surrender, threats against loved ones, promises of power or mercy that were worth less than the breath required to speak them. But something about Vex's expression suggested that this message was different. "Play it," Amalric ordered, his voice steady despite the cold certainty growing in his chest. The Vox speakers crackled with interference before a voice emerged from the static. It was human, or had been once, though the years of service to the dark gods had left their mark on vocal cords and larynx alike. The words carried harmonics that suggested the speaker's throat had been modified with demonic symbiotes, allowing for vocalizations that no baseline human could produce. Marshal Marius Amalric of the Cadian 4th Shock Troops, the voice began, each syllable pronounced with careful precision. Defender of the Gate, Sword of the Emperor, bearer of the Honorifica Majoris for actions during the Badab War, husband to Helena Amalric, deceased 7 years past from the wasting plague. Father to Marcus Amalric, currently serving with the Cadian Youth Corps at the White Shield Academy on distant Ophelia's 7th. The blood drained from Amalric's face as the voice continued its recitation of personal details that should have been buried in classified files. Information that no servant of chaos should have been able to access. But the speaker was just getting started. You stand now upon the walls of a dying world, watching the sky burn with the light of your species' extinction. You cling to hope because it is all you have left. Because the alternative is to accept the magnitude of your failure. But hope is a luxury that Cadia can no longer afford. The 13th Black Crusade is not like the others. This time we have not come to test your defenses or measure your resolve. We have come to end this charade once and for all. The transmission paused, and in that silence, Amalric could hear something else in the background. Voices, dozens of them, speaking in perfect unison in languages that had been forbidden since the age of strife. The words themselves were meaningless to him, but their rhythm seemed to match the throbbing ache that had been building behind his temples for days. You wonder how we know so much about you, about your family, about the intimate details of your service record. The answer is simple, Marshal. We know because we have always known. Because the corruption you seek to hold back at the Cadian Gate has already spread far beyond your ability to contain it. Every world you have fought to protect already harbors the seeds of its own destruction. Every victory you have won has served our purposes as much as your own. The voice laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with children weeping. Your son Marcus sends his regards, by the way. He speaks so fondly of his father, the great hero of Cadia. Of course, the words emerge somewhat differently now that his vocal cords have been replaced with blessed symbiotes of Slanesh. But the sentiment remains the same. Amalric's hand moved to his sidearm before he could stop himself, the motion automatic and meaningless. There was no target here to shoot, no enemy to charge, no tactical solution that could address what he was hearing. His son, his only child, the last connection to a woman he had loved more than life itself, had been corrupted by the very forces he had spent his life fighting. The realization hit him like a physical blow, driving him to his knees despite the power armor that should have provided structural support. Around the command chamber, his staff stood frozen, their faces reflecting his own horror and disbelief. They understood what this meant, what it represented for their cause and their world. If the Chaos forces could reach even the most protected facilities in the Imperium's interior, if they could corrupt the very children of Cadia's defenders, then no place was safe. No victory was final. No sacrifice was enough. But enough about family reunions, the voice continued, its tone shifting to something that might have been mistaken for sympathy if it had come from any other source. You have more immediate concerns to address. The Blackstone Fortress has been charging its primary weapon systems for the past 6 hours. In approximately 12 minutes, we will commence orbital bombardment of Kasserkraf and its surrounding defensive positions. The weapon systems are calibrated to punch through your void shields and penetrate to the planet's core. What follows will be educational. The transmission ended with a burst of static that left the command chamber in stunned silence. Outside, the sounds of battle continued unabated, but they seemed distant now, almost irrelevant compared to the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Amalrich remained on his knees, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he had learned. 12 minutes. Enough time to evacuate some personnel, perhaps, but not nearly enough to save the fortress or the millions of civilians sheltering within its walls. The Blackstone Fortress's weapons were capable of cracking continents. If the despoiler was willing to use them directly on Cadia, it meant that the planet's strategic value as an intact fortress world was less important to him than its destruction as a symbol of imperial resistance. "Sir," Major Corvin called from across the chamber. "Orders, sir." The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of command responsibility and the knowledge that any answer would be inadequate to the scale of the crisis they faced. Amalrich could order an evacuation, but most of his people would not make it to safety in time. He could call for reinforcement from the orbital defense platforms, but they were already engaged with the Chaos Fleet and could not disengage without exposing other critical positions. He could attempt to contact High Command and request permission to surrender, but he knew that such a request would be denied even if there were time to receive a response. The choices available to him were all variations of the same theme: how to die well in service to the Emperor. "Sound general quarters," he said, rising to his feet with the mechanical precision of a lifetime's military conditioning. "All personnel to battle stations. Contact the orbital defense grid and request maximum fire concentration on the Blackstone Fortress, and send a message to every remaining stronghold on the planet. Tell them..." He paused, searching for words that could convey both the hopelessness of their situation and the importance of continuing to fight despite it. "Tell them that Cadia stands. Whatever else happens, Cadia stands." The next 12 minutes passed with the dreamlike quality that often accompanied moments of extreme crisis. Amalrich watched his staff execute their final duties with professional competence, their training overriding the natural human response to panic. Emergency protocols activated throughout the fortress as personnel moved to predetermined positions, their actions coordinated by procedures developed over centuries of siege warfare. But even as they worked, everyone in the command chamber understood that they were participating in an elaborate ritual rather than meaningful preparation for survival. The motions of military readiness provided psychological comfort, a familiar framework for action in a situation that offered no realistic hope of success. They were not preparing to fight so much as preparing to die with dignity. The chronometer on the main display counted down the final minutes with mechanical indifference. 10 minutes. 9. 8. Outside the fortress walls, the sounds of battle continued as Cadian defenders engaged Chaos ground forces across multiple fronts, unaware that their world was about to end. At the 7-minute mark, something changed in the quality of light filtering through the command chamber's armored windows. The purple and gold chaos of the corrupted sky began to intensify, taking on colors that had no names in any human language. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe despite the atmosphere recycling systems that maintained optimal conditions throughout the fortress. "Sir," Lieutenant Carth reported from the sensor station, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "I'm reading massive energy buildup from the Blackstone Fortress. Power levels are off the charts. Whatever they're preparing to do, it's going to be..." She never finished the sentence. At exactly 0359 hours, the Blackstone Fortress fired. The weapon itself was invisible, detectable only by the effects it had on the space between the fortress and the planet below. Reality rippled like water disturbed by a thrown stone, and for a moment, the laws of physics seemed to hesitate before deciding how to respond to forces that should not exist in the material universe. Then the beam struck Kasserkraf. Amalrich's last coherent memory was of the fortress walls simply ceasing to exist, not exploding, not crumbling, but fading from reality like a dream upon waking. The ancient stone, blessed by 1,000 generations of tech priests and consecrated with the blood of martyrs, unraveled at the molecular level as the Blackstone weapon rewrote the fundamental constants that governed matter and energy in local space. He had time for one final thought before the wave of unmaking reached the command chamber. His son, Marcus, the boy who had built model aircraft and dreamed of joining the Imperial Navy. The young man who had written letters home describing his training and his determination to serve the Emperor as faithfully as his father had done. That boy was gone now, consumed by corruption and transformed into something that wore his face while serving masters dedicated to humanity's destruction. But in those final microseconds before oblivion claimed him, Amalric chose to remember the child Marcus had been rather than the thing he had become. The thought brought him peace, even as the universe dissolved around him. But the destruction of Casa Craf was only the beginning. The Blackstone Fortress, its primary weapon systems now fully operational, began a systematic bombardment of Cadia's major defensive positions. Each shot tore through the planet's crust like a heated blade through ice, sending shockwaves through the continental plates that supported the world's surface geography. In the depths of space, aboard the command bridge of his flagship Vengeful Spirit, War Master Horus Lupercal watched the destruction with satisfaction. The title was false, stolen from the memory of a greater warrior who had fallen 10,000 years past, but it served his purposes. The forces under his command recognized strength, and strength was measured in the currency of successful conquest. The being who had once been Ezekiel Abaddon, champion of chaos undivided and architect of 13 Black Crusades, no longer existed as a distinct personality. What remained was a composite entity, a fusion of human ambition and demonic power that wore familiar flesh while serving purposes that transcended individual identity. The transformation had taken place gradually over the course of millennia, each victory and each defeat adding new layers to a consciousness that had grown beyond the boundaries of singular existence. "Status report," the War Master commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vocal cords enhanced with demonic symbiotes. "Orbital bombardment proceeding according to plan," reported the ship's demon Prince Navigator, a creature that had once been human, but now existed as a living bridge between the material universe and the warp. Primary defensive positions on the northern continent have been neutralized. Resistance in the southern hemisphere remains significant but manageable. The War Master nodded, his attention focused on the tactical displays that showed Cadia's death throes in abstract symbols and casualty estimates. Each fortress that fell, each population center that disappeared in fire and madness, represented another step toward the completion of a plan that had been 13,000 years in the making. But the destruction of Cadia was not an end in itself. It was a key, a component in a larger mechanism designed to tear open the galaxy itself and allow the full force of chaos to pour through into reality. The planet's unique position at the mouth of the Eye of Terror made it a natural focus point for the kind of ritual workings that could affect change on a galactic scale. Its destruction would destabilize the entire Cadian Gate, creating a permanent breach in the barriers that separated the material universe from the realm of chaos. "Begin Phase 2, he ordered, his words carrying across the bridge through Vox systems enhanced with demonic interfaces. "Deploy the demon engines to the planet's surface. I want every remaining population center converted or eliminated within 6 hours, and activate the ritual sites. It's time to complete what we started." Across the Chaos Fleet, massive launch bays opened to disgorge their cargo of horrors onto the dying world below. Demon engines, fusion of machine and spirit that violated every principle of Imperial technology, streaked through the atmosphere like falling stars. Some were shaped like massive insects, their mechanical limbs designed for burrowing through fortified positions and consuming defenders from within. Others resembled predatory birds, their wings forged from metals that existed only in the deepest reaches of the warp. But the most terrible of the demon engines were those that had been crafted to resemble imperial war machines, corrupted land raiders that bled from their weapon mounts, dreadnoughts whose sarcophagi contained not honored veterans, but screaming masses of demon flesh, titans whose void shields had been replaced with barriers of crystallized hatred that could stop physical attacks, while allowing psychic corruption to pass through unimpeded. These abominations fell upon the remaining Cadian defensive positions like the wrath of dark gods made manifest. Their weapons fire did not simply kill, but transformed, turning loyal imperial citizens into raw material for further corruption. The dead did not stay dead, but rose as plague zombies or demon hosts, their corpses animated by entities that fed on the despair and suffering of the living. In the underground bunkers beneath Casa Gallen, Colonel Sarah Vex led the defense of what had once been a major communications hub. The facility had been designed to coordinate planetary defense operations, its deep tunnels and reinforced chambers proof against all but the most determined assault. But as demon engines tore through the upper levels with mechanical claws and warped weaponry, she began to understand that conventional defensive doctrine offered little guidance for their current situation. "Sector 7 is gone," reported Sergeant Corvin, his face grim as he monitored the tactical displays. The demon engines broke through the primary blast doors like they were made of paper. "I'm reading multiple contacts moving through the communications center." Vex nodded, her mind racing through tactical options that grew more limited by the minute. The bunker had been built to withstand orbital bombardment and direct assault by conventional forces, but its designers had never considered the possibility of attackers that could phase through solid matter or weapons that fired ammunition composed of crystallized screams. "Fall back to the secondary positions," she ordered, her voice carrying across the command center through internal Vox systems. "Seal the access tunnels behind us and activate the emergency protocols. If we can't hold them, we'll make sure they don't take anything useful." The emergency protocols she referred to were not listed in any official Imperial Guard manual. They had been developed by Cadian commanders over the course of 13 previous Black Crusades, refined through hard experience with enemies that played by no recognizable rules of engagement. When conventional tactics failed, when retreat was impossible, and victory was out of reach, there remained one final option: scorched earth. If Cadia must fall, it would fall in such a way that its conquerors would find nothing of value among the ruins. The secondary position was a maze of corridors and defensive positions carved into the living rock beneath the communications facility. Here, the surviving members of the garrison could make their final stand, selling their lives as dearly as possible, while the automated destruction charges eliminated everything that might be useful to the enemy. But as they retreated through the tunnels, Vex began to notice things that should not have been possible. The rock walls showed signs of recent modification, carved with symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The air carried scents that belonged to no earthly environment, chemical signatures that suggested the presence of materials that could not exist in normal space-time. "Colonel," called Private Hest from the rear guard, his voice tight with something that might have been panic or religious ecstasy. "There's something following us. Multiple contacts, but they're not showing up on the sensors properly. It's like they're there and not there at the same time." Vex turned to look back down the tunnel they had just traversed, her augmented vision cycling through multiple spectra in an attempt to identify the threat. What she saw defied easy description. Shapes that might have been human moved through the darkness, but their proportions were wrong, their movements too fluid for bipedal locomotion. Some of them appeared to be floating several inches above the tunnel floor, while others seemed to be partially embedded in the rock walls, as if solid matter were no obstacle to their passage. But it was their eyes that commanded her attention. Every one of the pursuing figures had eyes that glowed with the same sickly light that emanated from the Eye of Terror itself, and in that light, she could see something that made her blood run cold. Recognition. These were not alien creatures or demon manifestations. They were human beings, or had been once. She could see familiar faces among the pursuers, people she had served with, friends and comrades who had died during the siege. But death had not ended their service. They had been claimed by something that used their forms to mock the living, while serving purposes that no loyal Imperial citizen could comprehend. "Run!" she whispered, the word barely audible through her Vox grill. "Colonel?" Sergeant Corvin asked, his voice uncertain. "Run!" she screamed, the command echoing through the tunnels with the force of absolute panic. They ran through corridors that seemed to stretch and contract like living things, past chambers that flickered between their original architecture and impossible geometries that existed in dimensions human minds were not equipped to perceive. Behind them, the pursuit continued with mechanical persistence, the corrupted dead maintaining perfect formation despite the challenging terrain. The chase ended at a massive blast door that sealed the entrance to the bunker's final defensive position. The door was a masterwork of Imperial engineering, 10 meters of blessed ceramite and consecrated steel that could withstand direct hits from Titan-class weapons. It represented absolute security, the last bastion where the defenders could make their stand while the destruction charges eliminated everything above. But as Vex entered her command codes into the door's access panel, she realized that security was an illusion. The symbols carved into the tunnel walls were not random decorations left by the enemy. They were components of a vast ritual circle, a pattern of corruption that had been growing beneath Cadia's surface for years, possibly decades. The planet itself had been turned into a weapon, its very foundations carved with blasphemous geometries that would channel the energies released by its destruction into something far worse than simple planetary death. Cadia would not merely be destroyed, it would be transformed into a permanent gateway between the material universe and the warp, a wound in reality that could never be healed. The blast door sealed behind them with a sound like thunder, but Vex knew it would not hold for long. The things pursuing them existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Physical barriers were inconveniences rather than obstacles. They would find a way through, or around, or simply manifest on the other side without bothering to traverse the intervening space. "Colonel," Corvin said, his voice carefully controlled. "The destruction charges are armed and ready. All we need is your authorization." She looked around the final chamber, taking in the faces of the men and women who had followed her into this tomb. They were good soldiers, loyal servants of the Emperor who deserved better than to die in the dark while their world burned above them. But they were also Cadians, born and raised on a planet where duty came before comfort and service came before survival. They understood what was at stake. They accepted what was required of them. "For Cadia," she said, her hand moving toward the detonation control. "For the Emperor," they replied in unison, their voices carrying the weight of 10,000 years of tradition. The charges detonated simultaneously throughout the facility, their explosion tearing through rock and steel with equal efficiency. The communications hub disappeared in a column of fire that reached from the planet's core to its surface, taking with it the classified information and strategic intelligence that might have aided the enemy's future operations. But even as the explosion consumed the bunker and everyone in it, Vex's final thought was not of victory or duty, or the glory of martyrdom. It was of the symbols carved into the tunnel walls, the geometric patterns that suggested the corruption had been growing beneath their feet for far longer than any of them had suspected. How long had the enemy been preparing for this moment? How long had Cadia's defenders been fighting a battle that had already been lost before it began? The question died with her, but the pattern revealed by her sacrifice continued to spread. Across the planet's surface, similar facilities were falling to demon engine assaults, their destruction revealing more sections of the vast ritual circle that had been carved into Cadia's foundations over the course of millennia. Each fortress that fell, each bunker that was overrun, each population center that disappeared in fire and corruption, added another component to a mechanism of such scope and complexity that its true purpose had remained hidden until the final moment of its activation. In orbit above the dying world, the War Master watched the progress of the ritual with satisfaction. The destruction of Cadia's military infrastructure was proceeding ahead of schedule, but more importantly, the planet's death was generating exactly the kind of psychic resonance required for the next phase of his plan. "Energy readings are within acceptable parameters," reported the Demon Prince Navigator, its multiple eyes focusing on displays that showed psychic turbulence across 17 different dimensional frequencies. "The ritual geometry is achieving coherence. Estimated time to cascade failure, 4 hours, 17 minutes. Cascade failure. The term was clinical, almost mundane, but it described an event that would reshape the galaxy. When Cadia died, it would not simply disappear from the material universe. It would tear a hole in space-time that would allow the raw stuff of chaos to pour through unfiltered, creating a permanent bridge between the warp and reality. The Eye of Terror, that great wound in the galaxy's heart where chaos reigned supreme, would expand beyond its ancient boundaries. It would consume star systems and sector groups, transforming billions of worlds into demon-haunted nightmare realms, where the laws of physics bent to the whims of entities that existed outside time and causality. But even that catastrophe was only the beginning. The ritual patterns carved into Cadia's foundations were connected to similar constructions on dozens of other worlds throughout the galaxy. Ancient sites that had been prepared over the course of millennia by cultists and traitors who served masters they never fully understood. When Cadia fell, it would trigger sympathetic responses across half the galaxy, creating a network of warp rifts that would tear the Imperium apart from within. Humanity's long war against the forces of chaos would finally end, not in victory or defeat, but in the complete transformation of the battlefield into something that transcended both concepts. The War Master's contemplation of cosmic victory was interrupted by a priority transmission from the surface. The voice that emerged from the communication system was recognizably human, though it carried harmonics that suggested the speaker's vocal cords had been modified with demonic enhancement. "My lord," the voice reported, its tone deferential but urgent. "We have encountered unexpected resistance in the planetary north. A group of space marines has established defensive positions around the Cadian command bunker. They are refusing standard surrender terms and have begun broadcasting some kind of counter-ritual on all frequencies." Space Marines. The War Master considered this development with interest rather than concern. The Adeptus Astartes were formidable opponents, capable of holding ground against odds that would overwhelm normal human forces. But they were also products of imperial doctrine, trained to think in terms of conventional warfare and tactical objectives. They could not truly comprehend what they were fighting against, and their very presence on Cadia's surface would serve his purposes as effectively as their absence. "Which chapter?" he asked. "Imperial Fists, my lord, and there are others. Ultramarines, White Scars, Salamanders, multiple chapters represented in small numbers. It appears to be some kind of joint task force." The information was intriguing. Multiple chapters working together suggested high-level coordination, the kind of operation that would be authorized only by the highest levels of Imperial command. Someone in the Imperium's leadership had recognized the true significance of the 13th Black Crusade and had assembled whatever forces they could gather for a final desperate defense. It would not be enough, but it would provide an interesting test of his force's capabilities. "Deploy the demon princes," he ordered, "all of them, and activate the greater summoning protocols. If the Imperium's finest warriors wish to make their final stand on Cadia, we shall give them opponents worthy of their reputation." Across the Chaos Fleet, reality began to buckle and twist as the barriers between dimensions grew thin. Daemon princes, the ascended champions of the dark gods, materialized in the void around their ships, their forms too terrible for unprotected minds to perceive. Some had been space marines once, their enhanced physiology providing a foundation for transformation into something that transcended the limitations of flesh and blood. Others had been drawn from different sources, their origins lost in the labyrinthine histories of corruption that stretched back to the Horus heresy itself. But all of them shared certain characteristics: immortality, power beyond mortal comprehension, and absolute dedication to the destruction of everything the Imperium represented. They were the dark mirror of the Space Marines below, examples of what the Emperor's finest warriors became when they abandoned loyalty for power and duty for personal advancement. The greater summoning protocols were even more dangerous, requiring the sacrifice of entire ship's crews to open gateways large enough for entities that existed primarily in the warp to manifest in physical space. Greater demons, the most powerful servants of the Chaos Gods, began to tear through the barriers between dimensions, their presence causing reality to convulse around them like an infected wound. These were beings of such power that their true forms could not be contained within the narrow confines of three-dimensional space. They existed simultaneously across multiple planes of reality, their consciousness spanning dimensions that human language had no words to describe. To encounter one was to confront the fundamental inadequacy of mortal perception, to realize that the universe contained horrors so vast that the human mind could only protect itself through insanity. On Cadia's surface, the small force of space marines that had gathered around the planetary command bunker watched the sky darken with the approach of enemies beyond counting. Captain Tor Garadon of the Imperial Fists stood at the center of the defensive perimeter, his power armor scarred by months of constant combat, his ancient stormbolter loaded with the last of his blessed ammunition. Around him, battle brothers from a dozen different chapters prepared for what they all understood would be their final engagement. They had been brought together not by strategic planning, but by circumstance. Survivors of units that had been shattered during the siege, individuals who had fought their way across a dying world to reach this last bastion of resistance. There was no hope of victory, no possibility of extraction, no chance that their sacrifice would change the ultimate outcome of the battle. But they were Space Marines, the Emperor's chosen warriors, and they would die as they had lived, standing between humanity and the darkness that sought to consume it. "Brothers," Garadon said, his voice carrying across the defensive positions through their shared Vox network. "We have served the Emperor faithfully. We have held the line when others faltered. We have been the bulwark against the terror. Today, we make our final stand not for glory or for tactical advantage, but because it is what we are. We are the sword that never dulls, the shield that never breaks, the fire that burns eternal in the darkness." The response came from every throat, a battle cry that had echoed across battlefields for 10,000 years. "For the Emperor!" But even as they prepared for their final battle, the Space Marines began to notice changes in their environment that spoke of corruption beyond anything they had faced before. The ground beneath their feet was warm to the touch, despite the perpetual winter that gripped Cadia's northern continent. The air carried scents that belonged to no earthly ecosystem, chemical signatures that suggested the presence of organic compounds that should not exist in normal space. Most disturbing of all, the very geometry of their defensive positions seemed to be shifting. Walls that had been straight began to curve in directions that the eye could not follow. Distances became unreliable, with ammunition supplies that should have been 20 meters away, requiring either 50 meters or 5 meters of travel to reach. The compass readings fluctuated wildly, as if magnetic north was moving around the horizon like the hand of a clock. Brother Sergeant Vex of the White Scars, his bionic eye cycling through multiple spectra, reported what his enhanced vision revealed. "The ritual patterns are everywhere, Captain. Carved into the bedrock, etched into the walls, even traced in the air itself with some kind of energy field. We're standing at the center of something vast, something that's been growing for centuries." Garadon nodded, his own tactical displays showing similar readings. The command bunker had been built on this site because of its strategic location and natural defensive advantages. But those same qualities had made it attractive to earlier builders, generations of them stretching back to Cadia's first settlement. Each group had left its mark on the location, adding to a palimpsest of construction and decoration that revealed disturbing patterns when viewed from the proper perspective. The Chaos forces had not chosen to make their final assault here by chance. They had been drawn to this location by the same forces that had influenced its selection for military use. The command bunker sat at the center of a vast ritual circle that had been under construction for millennia, each stone carefully placed according to geometric principles that served purposes beyond simple architecture. "How long?" he asked. Vex consulted his readings, his augmented brain processing data streams that would have overwhelmed a baseline human nervous system. Difficult to calculate precisely, but based on the complexity of the patterns and the erosion rates of the carved stone, I would estimate that construction began sometime during the 32nd millennium, possibly earlier. 6,000 years. The corruption beneath Cadia ran deeper and older than anyone had suspected, reaching back to the very foundations of the world's settlement by Imperial forces. Every prayer offered in the planet's cathedrals, every oath sworn by its defenders, every drop of blood shed in its defense, had contributed to a ritual of such scope and ambition that its true purpose could only be understood in hindsight. The defenders of Cadia had not been protecting the Imperium from the forces of chaos. They had been unwitting participants in their own destruction, their faith and sacrifice channeled into a mechanism designed to tear the galaxy apart. The realization should have been crushing, a revelation of failure so complete that it rendered meaningless every victory the planet's defenders had ever achieved. But Garadon found himself oddly unmoved by the knowledge. He was a space marine, genetically modified and psychologically conditioned for warfare that transcended normal human understanding. The scale of the deception did not change his fundamental nature or his commitment to duty. If Cadia had been corrupted from its foundations, if every prayer and sacrifice had served the enemy's purposes, then the only response was to ensure that its final moments served the Emperor instead. The ritual that was consuming the planet required specific conditions to achieve its ultimate goal. The presence of loyal Imperial forces at its center might not be enough to prevent its completion, but it could potentially corrupt its function enough to limit the damage. A flawed victory for chaos was still preferable to a perfect one. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying across the defensive positions with the authority of absolute conviction. "We cannot prevent what is coming, but we can ensure that when it arrives, it finds us still fighting. We can make certain that the last thing this world hears is the sound of bolters firing in the Emperor's name." The demon assault began moments later, heralded by a sound like reality, screaming as it was torn apart to allow entities of pure chaos to manifest in physical space. The air above the command bunker opened like a wound, spilling creatures onto the battlefield that existed in violation of every natural law that governed the material universe. Some of the demons were recognizable as corrupted versions of familiar forms, their shapes based on twisted memories of mortal life. Others were purely abstract, geometric impossibilities that moved through space according to mathematics that belonged to no earthly discipline. All of them radiated an aura of wrongness so intense that unprotected humans would have lost their sanity merely from being in their presence. But the Space Marines were not unprotected humans. Their power armor was blessed against demonic influence. Their weapons consecrated with oils that had been sanctified on holy terror itself. Their minds had been conditioned through years of hypnotic therapy and chemical modification to resist the kinds of psychological attacks that demons used to break their opponents before battle was even joined. They opened fire with the precision that had made them legends across the galaxy, their bolters spitting explosive shells at targets that danced through dimensions like living nightmares. Some of the demons fell to conventional weapons fire, their manifestation in physical space making them vulnerable to physical damage. Others proved more resilient, their forms reconstructing themselves from the raw stuff of chaos, even as bolter rounds tore through their substance. But the real test came when the demon princes joined the assault, their power so vast that reality bent around them like space around a massive gravitational field. These were beings that had transcended mortality through service to the dark gods, former champions who had proven themselves worthy of elevation to something approaching divine status. The largest of them was something that had once been a space marine, though its original chapter affiliations were lost beneath layers of mutation and demonic enhancement. It stood 4 meters tall, its form a fusion of power armor and living flesh that pulsed with unholy life. Where its eyes should have been, stars burned with the cold light of dying worlds. Its weapon was a blade forged from crystallized hatred, capable of cutting through both matter and spirit with equal ease. "I am Vorthak the Scarred," it announced, its voice carrying across the battlefield despite the absence of any visible vocal apparatus. "Once I served the false emperor as you serve him now. I have seen the truth that lies beyond loyalty and duty. I have tasted the power that comes from abandoning the lies you cling to." Captain Garradon stepped forward to meet the challenge, his power sword crackling with energy as its ancient machine spirit awakened to the presence of the enemy. "I am Tor Garradon, captain of the Imperial Fists, defender of the Eternal Fortress, bearer of the Storm of Iron. I have never faltered, never yielded, never compromised with the enemies of mankind. Today, I add your name to the list of the fallen." The duel that followed was less a fight than a collision between opposing philosophies made manifest in violence. Garradon fought with the precision and discipline that had been drilled into him over centuries of training and warfare, his movements economical and effective, his blade seeking the weak points in his opponent's defenses with mechanical determination. Vorthak fought like a force of nature, his attacks carrying the raw power of chaos itself, his blade cutting through space-time to strike at targets across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Where his weapon touched the ground, reality bled, leaving wounds in the fabric of existence that would take millennia to heal. Around them, the battle raged between space marines and demons, bolter fire and demonic powers creating a storm of destruction that consumed the landscape for kilometers in every direction. The command bunker's defenses, built to withstand orbital bombardment, began to fail under the assault of weapons that attacked the very concepts of matter and energy rather than simply applying force to destroy them. But even as the Imperial position crumbled, even as the defenders fell one by one to enemies that could not be killed by conventional means, the ritual beneath their feet began to show signs of disruption, the presence of loyalist space marines at the center of the corruption, their faith and fury acting like a spiritual poison in the bloodstream of the Great Working, introduced variables that its architects had not accounted for. The geometric patterns carved into bedrock began to shift and blur, their precise angles becoming approximate as the power flowing through them encountered resistance from sources that existed outside the normal framework of physical law. The energies that were supposed to tear open a permanent gateway to the warp instead began to feed back on themselves, creating standing waves of destruction that threatened to consume the ritual site itself. In orbit above the dying world, the War Master watched the disruption of his grand design with something approaching admiration for his enemy's resourcefulness. The Space Marines could not prevent Cadia's destruction, but their presence at the ritual site was indeed corrupting its function. Instead of a clean transition that would create a stable gateway for Chaos forces to pour through, the planet's death would now be a chaotic event that might take decades or even centuries to fully resolve. It was not the outcome he had planned for, but it was acceptable. The important thing was that Cadia would fall, and with its fall, the Cadian Gate would be broken forever. The Imperium's primary defense against Chaos invasion would be eliminated, opening the way for campaigns that would dwarf even the Horus Heresy in their scope and destructive power. "Begin the final phase," he ordered, his words carrying across the bridge with the weight of absolute authority. "All ships, concentrate fire on the planet's core. I want complete destabilization within the hour." The Chaos Fleet responded to his command with mechanical precision, every vessel in the Armada redirecting its fire toward the coordinates that would cause maximum damage to Cadia's geological structure. The Blackstone Fortress, its weapon systems operating at maximum power, began punching holes through the planet's crust that reached almost to the molten core itself. But it was not the bombardment alone that would finish Cadia. Deep beneath the planet's surface, in chambers that had been sealed since the dark age of technology, ancient mechanisms began to activate in response to the psychic turbulence created by the ritual's disruption. These were devices that had been built for purposes long forgotten, their functions so dangerous that their very existence had been classified beyond the highest levels of Imperial clearance. They had been designed as a final failsafe, a way to ensure that certain strategic locations could never be captured intact by hostile forces. But their activation required specific conditions: massive psychic disruption, structural damage to the planet's crust, and the presence of authorized Imperial personnel to confirm that the situation had deteriorated beyond hope of recovery. All of those conditions were now being met simultaneously for the first time in recorded history. On the surface, Captain Garadon felt the change before he could identify its source. The ground beneath his feet began to vibrate with a frequency that seemed to resonate directly with his enhanced nervous system, creating a sensation like tuning forks striking in harmony throughout his body. His power armor's sensor systems registered energy readings that climbed beyond their maximum calibration ranges, while his enhanced hearing picked up sounds that seemed to come from the planet's core itself. He was still locked in combat with the demon Prince Vorthak when the first of the ancient failsafes activated. The effect was immediate and devastating. A column of pure energy erupted from the ground directly beneath the command bunker, its passage through the surface layers creating an explosion that could be seen from orbit. The Demon Prince was caught directly in the energy discharge, its form instantly unraveling as the ancient technology tore apart the bonds that held its essence in physical manifestation. Its final scream was a sound like the death of stars, a noise so terrible that several of the surviving Space Marines fell to their knees with blood streaming from their ears. But Garadon remained standing, his enhanced physiology allowing him to endure conditions that would have killed an unmodified human instantly. Through the chaos of the explosion, he could see the true scope of what was unfolding. The energy discharge was not random but part of a pattern, a grid of similar eruptions that were appearing across Cadia's surface as the ancient failsafes activated in sequence. The planet was not simply dying, it was committing suicide, using weapons that had been built into its very foundations to ensure that its destruction would deny any victory to the forces of chaos. The realization filled him with something that might have been joy if Space Marines were capable of such simple emotions. Cadia would fall, but it would fall on its own terms, taking as many of its enemies with it as possible. The ritual that was supposed to create a permanent gateway would instead become a nova of destruction that would consume everything within several light years of the planet's position, including the Chaos fleet that hung in orbit above. The War Master's final moments were spent in contemplation of the irony that defined his defeat. He had planned for every contingency, accounted for every variable, anticipated every possible form of resistance that the Imperium might offer. But he had not considered that the defenders of Cadia might choose to destroy their own world rather than allow it to serve his purposes. The ancient fail-safes that erupted from the planet's core were weapons from the dark age of technology, devices so powerful that they had been banned by the Adeptus Mechanicus for reasons that went beyond simple destructive capability. They did not merely destroy matter but unraveled the fundamental forces that held atoms together, creating zones of absolute dissolution that consumed everything they touched. The effect spread outward from Cadia at the speed of light, a wave of annihilation that erased everything in its path from existence. Ships, demons, entire fleets of invaders, all of it simply ceased to be as the fail-safes rewrote the laws of physics in local space to eliminate any possibility of recovery or reconstruction. The War Master himself lasted perhaps a microsecond longer than his fleet, his enhanced physiology and demonic augmentations providing minimal protection against forces that operated at the quantum level. His final thought was a fragment of regret, not for his failure, but for the magnitude of the opportunity that had been lost. He had come so close to achieving the ultimate victory, so near to completing a plan that had been millennia in the making. But Cadia stands, even as it dies, even as it takes half the sector with it into oblivion, in the deepest bunkers of holy terror, in chambers buried so far beneath the imperial palace that their existence was known only to the emperor himself. Ancient sensors registered the death of Cadia with mechanical precision. The loss was noted, catalogued, and filed away in archives that contained the accumulated wisdom and tragedy of 10,000 years of warfare. But in those same archives, new entries began to appear. Reports from across the galaxy of similar ancient fail-safes activating on worlds that had never been thought to possess them. Planets that had seemed strategically worthless revealed themselves to be components in a defensive network that spanned the entire galaxy. Each world prepared for the possibility that it might need to sacrifice itself to deny victory to humanity's enemies. The Emperor had been planning for this day since the very beginning, since the first human settlements had spread beyond their home system to claim the stars as their birthright. Every world that bore the imperial eagle, every fortress that had been blessed in his name, every shrine that offered prayers for his protection, all of it had been components in a vast machine designed to ensure that humanity would survive even the complete collapse of the Imperium itself. Cadia had been the key, the central node in a network that extended across space and time. Its destruction activated fail-safes that had been sleeping for millennia, awakening defenses that would make the galaxy itself into a weapon against the forces of chaos. The war was far from over. The 13th Black Crusade had broken the Cadian Gate and opened new fronts across the galactic north. Billions would die in the conflicts to come. Worlds would burn, and entire sectors would be consumed by the darkness that poured through the wounds torn in reality. But humanity would endure. They would adapt, survive, and eventually find a way to push back against the forces that sought their extinction. Because they were human, and humans had never learned to surrender, even when surrender would have been the rational choice. On the ruined surface of what had once been Cadia, in the minutes before the final fail-safes activated and erased the planet from existence, Captain Tor Garadon raised his battered stormbolter toward the chaos-tainted sky and fired a final salvo of blessed bolter rounds into the darkness above. The shells disappeared into the void, their paths carrying them toward targets that no longer existed, their explosive warheads detonating harmlessly in empty space. But the gesture itself carried meaning that transcended its tactical utility. It was defiance made manifest, resistance embodied in the simple act of continuing to fight long after victory had become impossible. When the fail-safes finally activated and the planet began to tear itself apart at the molecular level, Garadon's last coherent thought was not of failure or loss, or the magnitude of the catastrophe that his world's destruction would unleash upon the galaxy. It was of duty fulfilled, of service rendered faithfully even unto death, of a promise kept to the Emperor who had created him for the specific purpose of standing between humanity and the darkness. Cadia falls, he thought, as reality unraveled around him. But the Imperium endures, the war continues, the Emperor protects, and in the cosmic scope of eternal warfare that defined existence in the 41st millennium, that was enough. It had to be enough, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate, and humans had never been a species given to contemplating terrible alternatives when there was still fighting to be done. The planet died in fire and fury and the screaming of the void, but its death was not an ending. It was a transformation, a moment of destruction that became the foundation for everything that would follow. The galaxy would remember Cadia not as a world that fell, but as a world that chose to die rather than serve the enemies of mankind. And in the memories of those who survived to carry the tale to distant stars, the planet would live forever, eternal as the Emperor's love, enduring as the promise of humanity's ultimate victory over the forces that sought its extinction. Cadia stands, even in death, even in the face of absolute annihilation, even as its atoms are scattered across the cosmos by forces that should not exist in any sane universe. Cadia stands, because standing is what Cadians do. It is what they have always done. It is what they will always do, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, no matter how many times the galaxy burns around them and is reborn from its own ashes. The planet is gone, but the spirit endures. The fortress may be broken, but the idea remains undefeated. The guard breaks, but it does not bend, and from its scattered remnants, 100 new regiments will be born to carry the fight to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. This is the lesson of Cadia, that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from holding the line, but from choosing where and how that line will finally break. That sometimes the most important battle is not the one you win, but the one you fight with such courage and determination that your enemies remember it long after your bones have turned to dust. The 13th Black Crusade ended not with the triumph of chaos, but with the realization that humanity's capacity for sacrifice transcended even the dark god's understanding of mortal limitations. They had sought to break the defenders of Cadia through force and corruption and the promise of power beyond imagining. Instead, they had learned that some things cannot be broken because they choose to shatter rather than bend, and in their shattering, they become more dangerous than they ever were while whole.